So, I'm writing a novel. Is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I will also answer listener questions and, sometimes, interview special guests. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. Last time, well, I don't know what you listened to last time. I'm recording this in early December of 2020 to release at an undetermined point in my future, which is now your present. True story. Anyway, we're trying something new today. See, this is like an interview in that I have a guest who I'll introduce in a second, but I won't be quizzing them about themselves, their writing career, and perhaps some specific field of literary knowledge. Not for most of the time anyway. Today you'll be listening in as I do one of my favorite things in the world, which is discussing someone's work in progress with them, consulting them on how they can further develop the story so as to achieve their goals with it, whether that's just to complete a satisfying first draft or get it as polished as can be for final publication. Nathaniel Webb, aka Nat20, is a Maine-based author of fantasy and science fiction, mystery, and non-fiction. He is also a musician, game designer, and software developer. His novels include the geek mystery A Conventional Murder, the game-lit adventure Expedition Summerlands from Level Up Publishing, and the Veil of Worlds urban fantasy trilogy from Vulpine Press. His music biography, Marillion in the 1980s, was a bestseller for Sonic Bond Publishing. He has also sold short stories and novellas in such subgenres as lit RPG and steampunk. I think I can get away with saying Nathaniel is a fan of sword and sorcery. In fact, he has an S&S short story published in issue number 4 of Whetstone magazine. I'll link to that in the show notes, it's free to read. Today, I'll be consulting him on a new sword and sorcery story, work in progress of his. He's got about 1,100 words written, and its holding title is the main character's name, Flue, spelled F-L-U-E. Because Flue is at the stage of being an incomplete first draft, it's basically as easy for me to read it to you than to summarize it. So, with Nathaniel's permission, of course, I'm now going to read it to you, and that will be followed by my discussion with Nathaniel. If you'd rather just skip ahead to the conversation we had about the story, then you'll want to skip to about 10 minutes and 35 seconds. Alright. Flue, incomplete first draft, as of December 13th, 2021. In the city of Lorden, on the Street of Wonders, Flue Montagne attempted to buy a rat. There was a man with a stall. He had sharp, beady eyes and a shirt that was bluer than anything Flue had seen in months. The stall comprised 3 sunken pens in which rats wriggled and slid over each other. Flue moved from one to the next, contemplating the animals. Other customers came and went. They handed over their coin and grabbed any old rat like it didn't even matter. "Break its neck for you?" said the Rat Jack. It was like a mantra. "Break its neck? No? Taking it home? Break its neck for you. No charge." Some accepted, others broke the necks themselves, and while mostly they stuffed their fresh slain merchandise into sacks and pouches as they strode away, some of them dug in right there on the street. Flue considered the squirming rats. They were mostly a drab, disappointing grey, like Flue herself. She'd chopped her brown hair as short as she could with a dagger, but it was still matted from weeks of sleeping in alleys. Her clothes were stained and too large. Hunger had kindled an unfamiliar gleam in her grey eyes. She dug through the pens, curious to see the rats buried under their kin. Now and then, one distinguished itself with an appealing pattern, a sable streak, a white ruff, a banded tail. Finding each standout sent a tiny thrill of satisfaction to her dull heart. But she couldn't stand here forever, not without the Rat Jack growing suspicious. Eventually, she narrowed the candidates down to 2. One was larger than average, more a shimmering silver than base grey. The other was small and long-nosed, all white, with an agouti hood. She nodded to herself, snaked a hand into the pile, and seized the big one gently. Her other hand pulled a small, gleaming rook from within her jacket. There were 2 cardinal distinctions between Flue and the other customers. First, she didn't intend to eat her rat. Second, she didn't intend to pay for it. When the torchlight playing over the rook's golden edge caught the Rat Jack's eye, she said, "I'd like this one, please." Avarice made his eyes flash as brightly as Flue's coin, then doubt clouded those eyes and they narrowed. "How's a little devil like you come by such a thing?" Flue set the rook on the stall with the flat of her palm. "Don't flash it around town and you'll never need wonder." Likely the Rat Jack suspected she'd cribbed it from some nabob up in the wealthy neighborhoods of Norwood, where folk had money in abundance, or at least they had money, full stop. This was a good guess, correct in all but the particulars. Disdaining to leg it all the way to Norwood just to cut a purse, Flew had stolen the rook closer to home. Regardless, it was possible enough that the rook's previous owner might come looking for it that the Rat Jack would be wise not to make a scene. It had been a stroke of uncommon good luck, pinching that rook, the first in a long and hungry time. With a little ingenuity, the thing could earn its value 100 times over. Starting with buying a rat. The Rat Jack snorted in acquiescence. His sharp eyes stayed fixed on Flew's while his hand dove into his pouch for the change. Flew's hand was busy too. While she stared the Rat Jack's challenge back at him, her palm was working subtly but quickly. The rook slipped into her sleeve. In its place dropped a brass pawn, carefully polished to a gleam and nearly indistinguishable from the rook in the poor purple light of evening. The Rat Jack slapped her change down on the stall. Flew shoved the pawn across the splintered wood and he palmed it without looking. She took her change, 9 priest and 4, shook her new pet gently at the Jack, and said, "Thanks." He gave her a gap-toothed smile that suggested she'd find less than correct change in her hand. "Break his neck for ya?" The Street of Wonders was a bright tangled thread of red, blue, and gold running north-south along the Isle of Lorden, which lay humped athwart the River Gaunt like an inconsiderate cat. The Rat Jack's stall occupied a space at the street's southern end near the iron bridge that separated the isle from Beast's Landing. So close to the dangerous south shore of the Gaunt, it was mostly quick-stitch joints and blessings on the cheap, but even mercenaries needed to eat. 5 blocks up the Street of Wonders, Flew changed her mind. Certainly the rat she'd bought had a certain charm. Its silvery sheen reminded one of a rapier's blade. Or at least it had when she was buying it. Now it looked more like the belly of some dead-eyed river fish. Well, the rat's size was noble, regal even, or perhaps just corpulent. Flew stopped abruptly, causing a collision between a strutting two-sworded bravo and a scurrying milkmaid. Flew hoped they would fall in love. She pondered. To return to the Rat Jack now, demanding an exchange of merchandise, was to court danger. She'd gotten away with her quick change act. Her purse clumped fatly on her hip with the weight of the money the Jack had unwittingly paid her to take as goods. On the other hand, the small rat's hood had been such a handsome, tawny shade, its body so elegantly slim. But risking her life on purely aesthetic motives was surely the height of foolishness. Flew sighed. Her motives had always been purely aesthetic, at least until things went south and her life became a grim struggle against starvation. She turned and made her way back down the Street of Wonders. The lunch rush had cleared from around the rat stall, leaving the Jack to reckon his take in relative solitude. He sighed contentedly and tipped the contents of his money pouch onto the counter of the stall. Flew hesitated. If he'd let all his coin get jumbled up, he might not notice she'd swapped a pawn for a rook. Of course, if there were no rook in the pouch at all. The Rat Jack looked up. By chance his eyes met Flew's. "You!" he pointed a shaking finger. "Come here, you brazen little shit! Guards!" Flew snorted. The City Watch never came to the Isle of Lorden. 10 years ago, maybe, but now... A heavy hand clomped down on her shoulder. "Got her, boss." Flew looked up. The big man's male coif and the scar-checkered face glowering within it described a life in private security. Of course. Flew stomped on the arch of his foot, screamed, "Kidnapper!" threw her rat at him, and ran. Donathan Valentine, the diabolist who'd rebuilt Flew's face, kept a shop on Loom Street across from a 2-pawn little theater where attractive people performed the classical dramas in more revealing costumes than historical accuracy required. Flew had chosen Valentine for this proximity. If he ever threatened her, she could rabbit for the stage door and rely on the actress to hide her. She'd slept enough cold nights outside the stage door that she knew them all. There were 2 reasons Donovan Valentine might threaten Flew. First, she owed him a huge amount of money. Second, he knew who she really was. Nor was it strictly true that she'd chosen Valentine purely by location. He knew who Flew was because he'd known her mother before she was murdered. He wouldn't help her out of charity, no diabolist worked for free, but he was willing to extend her credit. Flew touched the purse at her hip. No matter how many times she ran the numbers, they didn't change. The money she'd scammed from the Rat Jack would cover about a quarter of last month's payment, assuming she kept none for herself. But was it better to make that paltry payment now with the promise of more to come? Or would Valentine prefer the full month of back pay all at once, a few days from now? "I expect," said a voice at Flu's shoulder. He would prefer last month's and this month's together immediately. All right, let's go chat with Nathaniel. And here we are with Nat. Hey, Nat.
Hey, how's it going, Oliver?
Not too bad. We just blew 20 minutes talking about stuff that could have been really fun for the recording. So let's hope we got more for this. We haven't run out of interesting things to say. So why don't we just warm up a little bit with you telling me what was the last sword and sorcery short story you really enjoyed reading and why? Like just the most recent. Don't worry about leaving people out.
If I have to pick one and it has to be recent and it has to be a short story, I think I am going to go with Cold in Blood by James Eng. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his last name right, but I think
I know.
Yeah, I would swear I heard somebody say it that way on something. But anyway, it's in the most recent issue of Tales from the Magician's Skull. It's one of his Morlock Ambrosius stories. And, I came into it. It was the first issue of The Skull I had read. It was the first of his stories I'd read. It was the first Morlock story, blah, blah, blah. But so came into it knowing absolutely nothing. And man, I was just blown away by this story. Like, it's not sword and sorcery in the, Conan climbing a tower and killing monsters with a sword sense at all. It's very voicey, if you know that term in modern publishing. Like this character Morlock has a very sort of almost modern feeling, but very kind of acerbic and darkly observational voice. And the story is basically like it's fantasy New Year's Eve, and he just wants to get really drunk, and instead he has to deal with this vampire. And in the end, like he kills a monster, but he didn't want to be there, and he kind of does the whole thing with this sense of ennui. And it was very different in a way that I think a lesser writer, it would have been just an absolutely dreadful mess. But it just really worked. I was just completely amazed by it. I came into it with no expectations and came out of it saying like, wow, this dude can write. So that's my recommendation, Cold in Blood.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've read that one too, actually. I really liked it. It wasn't my first Morlock Ambrosius. That was probably, I think there was a story with that character in issue 3. That was the first Tales of the Magician's Skull that I read. But yeah, I've read everything except for the incredibly difficult to find issue 2.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah.
So I feel relatively up to date on at least the Tales stories of Morlock. And yeah, I would recommend them as well, including that particular story, which if you're not someone like me who has trouble reading too much on screens, you can find issue 2 as a PDF. So listener, if you want to get the whole set, you can, as long as you're cool with doing it digital or finding a very generous person to buy the issue number 2 from.
Or taking a second mortgage in your house.
Yeah, that shipping. I had someone who wanted to, was willing to sell me the copy at cost, and I was like, awesome. And then the shipping from the States to Canada was unbelievable. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, but yeah, so okay, cool, good choice, I would say. Not that there was a wrong choice. And then is this story, Flu, your only work in progress, or are you juggling like a handful?
Oh my God, no! I'm a work in progress slut. Absolutely. I mean, I've got, and it's partially maybe a lack of focus, but I'm working on this. I've got a second Farager Drowning Bell story that I've written but needs a lot of polishing that I'm hoping to submit whenever the next issue of Whetstone comes out, or whenever they
So for anyone
open.
who's listening who doesn't know, that is your character in the most recent issue of Whetstone, yep?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I've already written a second story with her that needs some work, but it's there and pretty much ready to pull the trigger whenever the next issue of Whetstone is underway. So I've got that, and then a couple fragmentary novels. I think I mentioned when we were sort of doing the run up to this that the pandemic ennui hit me pretty hard, and it's funny because I don't leave my house very much anyway. But for some reason, having that option taken away is very different from choosing not to leave your house. And so, it's the last couple of years have been a little challenging in terms of focus and energy and all that stuff, as they have been for everybody, I think.
Yeah, you're not alone. I mean, recently that has just changed for me. Until, basically this coming week, I have been working from home the whole pandemic. And similarly, I was like, well, my routine's actually not terribly disrupted. But even so, you have the option taken away. And you're like,
Yeah. And so, I've got the starts of a few novels, and some are better than others, I think. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm always, and I like to jump between projects, and you get jazzed about one thing and you work on that for a while. And then when you start feeling a little burnt out about that, then you have something else you can move to for a little while. And, that kind of keeps me going.
I hear you on the pandemic slump. So hopefully this discussion will give you a bit of a boost, for working on this story. And actually, coming back to something in our messaging over the Whetstone Tavern Discord running up to this, you said, if I can quote you here, I'm in a weird weird spot where I've written a few novels, but I'm just starting to take short story writing seriously, and it's harder than expected.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what specifically are you finding harder than you expected?
Oh, well, they're just so short, aren't they?
Right there in the name.
Yeah, somebody should have warned me. Yeah, no, I mean, in a novel, when I write, I tend to write with a word count goal in mind. That helps me kind of structure and plan and everything. But with a novel, even if you're writing a shorter novel, there's still just a ton of space to stretch out and explore ideas and, give your characters room to talk to each other and think to themselves and all that kind of stuff. And, not every scene needs to strictly drive the plot forward, blah, 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 blah. And when you take that freedom away and you cut it down to 7,000 words, or even, Whetstone has a hard limit of 2,500 words. I mean, my God, the amount of work that I put into that first story that they accepted, it would have been easier to write it 5,000 words. And the work to cut it down to 2,500, but still keep all the character moments that I wanted, keep the themes that I wanted, keep all the action that I wanted, and just make it so dense with all that stuff, and it was, I learned a lot from doing it, but it was very challenging.
Yeah, no, I sympathize with all of that. I've been lucky in that screenwriting has actually weirdly prepared me for short stories in the one sense that with screenwriting, everything you put on the page is going to cost money. Right. And
Yeah.
so, it is encouraged to, the first draft is the first draft, right? But by the time you get to the kind of thing that's going to actually get shot, or maybe that you're going to submit around to agents and try and pitch and so on. Yeah. Like, can you take these 3 locations and crunch them down to 1?
Yep,
So there's stuff like that. And obviously special effects and other more obvious things like that. Can these 2 characters become 1 character? Can we get rid of this dog and just have a picture of a dog? And so in that
You've just ruined John Wick.
I'm sorry. He lit my picture of a dog on fire. It's not very motivating. I don't care. He just goes and starts a bakery. But yeah, so with short stories, I am finding like that the skills I developed with screenwriting to crunch stuff down and really be like, what do I need, or how can I get a character beat in like a glance because I don't have room for a monologue, has been very helpful. I'm not saying it's made it easy, but it's been helpful. And so hopefully, I can help you out here with some of what we're dealing with today. But before we get to the specific concerns you had about this story, actually, we just about danced over it here. Do you have a word count in mind for this story?
Yeah, I do. I'm shooting for 6,000 words. And what I'm finding as I write short stories is that if I shoot for 6,000, it'll come out somewhere around 7,000.
Yep. I've just done that myself. I was aiming for 6 and I got about 7.2 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's still sort of, I think, in the safe zone where most markets, especially sword and sorcery markets, they're looking for something right around that 7,000 word mark, a little bit on either side. Again, Whetstone obviously accepted. So, if it goes over, it goes over. But yeah, that's the goal.
Well, that's interesting because I know Tales does 6. Whetstone, the short end, as we just said. Most places I have seen, not that I've seen all places, I find they cap around 5. So that's actually my goal for this story I'm working on.
Interesting.
So it might be interesting to compare lists when we're not recording, because that would be very boring for other people to listen on.
Yes.
But
the spreadsheet podcast.
It is interesting to try and find like a market average for the genre you're submitting in. And be like, okay, I should aim for this-ish. Of course, you can always have different drafts, but I don't know. I mean, to me, that'd be too much like job hunting where you have to do a specific CV for each role to have the better chance of getting in, and having a specific edit for each market. I guess if I had the time and energy, but... Oof.
Yeah, and I thought about that because I finished this Farrager Drowning Bell story, the second one that I'm going to submit to Whetstone eventually, and it's right at 2,500 words. And I thought, well, gosh, there's enough going on here that maybe I could expand it to 5,000 and, send that around to other places. And then I just thought, I don't think that works for this character in the sense that she came to life as a Whetstone story. And there's such a density to the way that you have to tell a story that's that short that actually really kind of informed the character and made her something different from what I expected. I thought she was going to be a lot chattier, for example, and there just wasn't space for that. But now she
got to cut that monologue.
Yeah. Exactly. And now she talks with her sword very much more than I anticipated. But, the form informs the story and the story informs the form, and it's, all of a piece, I guess.
Oh, exactly. Like I have just barely, because I have another thing, that 7.2 guy, I want to get that a bit further along before I really dig into it, but I'm starting something for Whetstone. And right away I was like, okay, I got 1.5 to 2.5K here. This will be a person who doesn't talk much, and I don't want to spoil much, but I basically have like a high speed. Have you ever seen the anime Redline?
No.
It's like a crazy bonkers sci-fi racing movie, which I strongly recommend. Super fun. You don't have to be into anime to dig it.
There you go. Now you're speaking my language.
Yeah, and it's like a complete story, so it's not you're not signing up for a big series. Anyway, it's super, super, super fun, and like it's just the pacing is bananas as you would expect in a movie about sci-fi crazy races.
Yep.
So like that's on my mind in part because of the, as you say, like the form that you're dealing with there, right? 2,500. So in a similar vein, do you have a specific place or short list of places you want to submit Flu to?
Yeah, the dream is that someday in the future, the Skull will open to unsolicited submissions again. I mean, to me, I love that magazine, and it's the high water mark of modern sword and sorcery, in my opinion. So that would be, might as well shoot for the stars.
Yeah.
So that would be, sort of bucket list achievement. But, there are, and we should compare notes after, a lot of places, actually, if you start really digging, that will at least consider sword and sorcery stories. There are other places that kind of explicitly look for them. Heroic Fantasy Quarterly. There's another one that I'm blanking on the name of at the moment, but there are a few markets for it explicitly where I think the story could work. So yeah, I think it'll come down to who's accepting submissions, and hopefully somebody will like it.
Well, you know what it just made me think would be really useful for anyone listening? We could build our little list together, because I'm happy to let's compare notes, right? Let's share our respective lists. And then if you're cool with it, maybe we could share that list in the show notes for the episode.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
To pay it forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. All right. So, okay, listener, if you're thinking yourself about wanting to sell a short and sorcery short story, check out the show notes where there should be probably a couple dozen links, I think at least. Now, speaking of which, it sounds like the answer is yes, but are you hell-bent on this story being sword and sorcery? If so, roughly how are you defining that? Like, what is sword and sorcery to you?
Yeah, so what's interesting to me is trying to combine genres and do something that's not, I'm not going to be so hubristic as to say that's never been done before, but do something that's a little different from what you'd necessarily expect if you hear sword and sorcery short story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a heist story, but it's also a sword and sorcery story. And so what that means to me is, very much inspired by The Tower of the Elephant, the famous Robert E. Howard Conan story, where he is breaking into this tower thinking he's going to steal a bunch of jewels and be a very rich man, and instead he finds a mournful ancient alien god who begs Conan to kill him and take his heart. So it's not going to be quite on that scale, but that's sort of the inspirational template here, that Flu is going to take on a job to steal a magic sword from a mercenary company, and then discover that there is more going on when she gets in there, not to the extent of ancient alien gods, but that there's, it's not so simple a job as she expected. And I think that is in keeping with the sword and sorcery tradition, right? You go into the tower or the dungeon or the castle or whatever, and then it turns out that there is magic there, and it's dark and it's sinister and it's not what you were expecting to find. But I think it's also in keeping with the heist story tradition, that it's always the most fun heist stories are when things go wrong and the hero or the team has to improvise and deal with the unexpected. So that's kind of the spin I'm putting on it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the three table legs of any heist story is the crew, whether it's one person or an Ocean's 11 situation, right? Yep. The plan and the complications.
Exactly.
Like if everything goes smoothly and it's over, like who cares?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I guess that's true of any story. And then everything went fine. The end is never.
Although they say with a heist movie, if they tell you the plan ahead of time, then you know that things are going to go wrong. If they don't tell you the plan ahead of time, then things are going to go more or less according to plan, and the fun is seeing what the plan was all along. And if you watch it, usually they'll follow either one or the other of those templates. But this one, the plan is not complicated until Flu gets in there, and then it gets complicated.
Okay. And honestly, I would say like a heist that can be very sword and sorcery. I forget who it was. I think it was Ashiguru on the Whetstone Tavern Discord said recently. We were talking about Howard quite a bit because there was someone who had just read one story and was like, I want to get into Conan. Yeah. And we were all like, well, you came to the right place. Here's 7 or 8 people at a time just like deluging you with recommendations. But well-meaning, but oh my God, I was one of them. So point being, he pointed out that one thing that's very easy to forget, and heck, even I forget sometimes, I'm like studying the heck out of it, thinking about it really hard, not only for my novel, but for presenting it in the podcast. Conan did a lot more than chop up dudes and like lead bandit parties and stuff, right? Like there were, one of the really fun things was sticking him in other kinds of stories, including but not limited to like murder mysteries, pirate stories, and heist stories, right? So I think it's absolutely SNS. And it's interesting to hear you mention that story. And of course, there's no wrong influence to be thinking of. I was thinking a lot of good old Fafnir and Grey Mouser. Maybe that's because I'm really deep in that at the moment with what I'm outlining in my book.
Yeah.
But definitely some of the stuff that you wrote here just kind of felt like I was, we were hanging out in like a Lankhmar-esque setup.
Yeah, and that's, I would be lying through my teeth if I denied that being a huge influence. And I would say probably the other specific story that I would name check here is The Two Best Thieves in Lankhmar, which is one of my favorite of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. It's sort of almost a throwaway one. It's short and it's kind of goofy, but it is actually written like a heist story because you've got Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. They're not exactly in a fight in the way they are in Lean Times in Lankhmar, but they're in a bit of a tiff because they've been traveling together for too long and they need some space. They've got these jewels that they need to sell, but the jewels are invisible. And so each of them individually has come up with a scheme of how he is going to sell these invisible jewels without the fence that they're selling to figuring out that they're invisible. And then they both get scammed in different ways. And so the story, it starts with sort of the quote unquote heist aspect of the clever plan that each of them has to unload these goods. Then it turns into the heist kind of how they were actually hoodwinked by the people they were selling to. So that was the other big inspiration that made me think like, gosh, this actually could really work, like fantasy heist. I kind of love it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's one of my favorites too. And I also like the fact that it was written just as like part of the later stitch up he did when he was trying to make all this stuff fit into one big saga. And so, yeah, it's very much like a between adventures adventure, and yet so good. Do you have, for Flu here, do you have an outline? Or are you figuring this story out as you write the first draft?
I've got an outline. I'm a hardcore outliner. I can never do it otherwise. That's what gets me past the, staring at a blank page, not knowing what to write, is working from an outline. And before that, doing brainstorming, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I've got it plotted out. The outline, things will always change when I'm actually writing it. Usually what'll happen is I'll find connections that I didn't see before when I'm just outlining it. Ideally, what happens is the characters kind of take on lives of their own, as writers love to talk about. And that will suggest things that I didn't see when I was just thinking about the plot. But yes, I know it's going to happen.
Okay, cool. And the last thing before we get sort of into discussing the concerns you had that you wanted us to get into, what was the singular idea, image, theme, the thing that first seized you and sent you down the path of writing this story?
I think it was probably reading The Two Best Thieves in Lankhmar and thinking, I want more stories like this, And if you can't find them, you got to write them, right? I'd possibly even the conversation that we were having on the Discord a while back where you had picked up the Alex stories by Joanna Russ.
Yes.
Because, of course, she makes a small and somewhat confusing cameo in Two Best Thieves in Lankhmar where she's called Alex the Picklock. And I just immediately thought, like, that's such a great name. And I want to read all these stories about Alex the Picklock and Lankhmar, like scamming dudes and getting rich. And then, unfortunately, you then informed me that that's not really what Joanna Russ's actual stories are.
No, I mean, the first three do feel like sword and sorcery, but they are not doing that. She was not writing, even though she's a thief and she does do a bit of thieving, and one story in particular, she kind of does a lot of thievery work for a guy, but even so, it's like the work she's doing. Anyway, whatever. We're not here to discuss that book, but yes, it's definitely not like what you've got here. You're doing your own thing here.
Yeah, and it's very much write what you want to read, and hopefully other people will like it, but at least I'll be satisfied.
Yeah, I completely understand. It varies from story to story in the novel I'm working on, but the one I'm almost done, I hope to finish the outline today, absolutely started from me reading Lean Times in Lankhmar. And being like, I want to do a Lean Times in Lankhmar. I say it in dumb voice because I like making fun of myself, but I think it's a very legit motivation to do something, just so long as you're like chasing kind of a vibe and wanting to do your own expression as opposed to, here's a formula. I will, break it down like a blueprint and then just copy that blueprint, but with my own names in places.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't get that feeling here. All of your stuff, just, a little warning for everybody, myself included sometimes. So, okay, let's get into the story here. Your main concern, as you worded it to me in an email, was, quote, the thing I'm most struggling with right now is managing backstory. Both the protagonist and the city setting have interesting, I think, background to them, and I'd like to get that across, but I'm trying to limit myself to only what's relevant to the story being told. And then we can kind of subdivide that into the city and then the character.
Yep.
Now, it's not been that long since you sent me that email. Do you still feel that that is something that you're wrestling with?
Yes, absolutely. And this is, I think every genre writer, especially fantasy and science fiction writers, struggles with this because you do all this world building and then you want to show it off, but very often it is not necessary for the story. And deciding how much detail to give to set the scene versus how much is just going to overload and bore the reader is a very difficult knife edge to walk, I think, especially again in a short story where you have so much less space and you really need to grip the reader from the beginning, because they're not going to give you, well, it's a 400-page book, so I'll give them 20 pages to see if this gets interesting, right? I mean, if you're writing a 6,000 word short story, it's got to be interesting from the word go. So yeah, I'm pausing here.
Sorry, no, that's okay. I mean, you get, it sounds like a complete
edit this
statement.
part out, Oliver.
Yeah. That's cool. Sounds like a complete statement to me, unless
Okay.
there's more you wanted to say. But no, absolutely. When you have 6,000 words, you don't have time to spend 10 pages on the Shire.
Yes.
Before everybody heads off to do a thing. And conveniently, before recording today, I was talking to someone else about their historical fiction story set in 1860s in a part of England that they know very well from when they were young. And so I think even if it's not genre stuff, like it can be the world building that we make up, right? Which almost certainly will be infused by some research, whether reading other stories or reading stuff from history, or a historical fiction story or any other story, a murder mystery, a heist tale in modern day or whatever. You do research, right? And when you're writing, you want that research to pay off. God damn it, you spent hours reading that book.
Exactly.
And so, there can be this thing where it's funny. I've heard people say, write to please yourself. Don't worry about a hypothetical audience when you write. And I'm like, yeah. No, yes, no. I mean, I think that that's a piece of advice where it's like, yeah, it applies if it in some specific cases and doesn't in others. The specific case of like trying to write to please someone else overall, yeah, that's not a good idea because you won't have the passion for the story. Write the thing you're passionate about, please yourself that way. But when it comes to world building, whether it's whole cloth fantasy, sci-fi, whatever creations from your head or research or a fusion of the two, you kind of need to think about the audience. Because everything you put on the page, you're asking them to read it. And is the payoff enough to justify the ask? And this is kind of what we got into chatting before we got into here. I won't be mean and name the book. I'm reading a book right now. I don't even have it on my Goodreads for the history because I think I don't like it. I don't want to be mean and have it up there, as a record of that thing I didn't finish because I didn't like it. But yeah, in that one, it's a big door wedge, which, sometimes I'm fine with. I've read Tim Hillock's The Religion earlier this year. That's a big door wedge. Loved it. But this door wedge is asking, I'm starting to feel anyway, too much of me because of the extreme level of detail about this character as they sort of go from someone who knows nothing to gradually knowing more and more, which I've only learned in the last week. There's a term for this, progression lit, news to me. As I say, I'm mostly trained in screenwriting, so now I find like I'm catching up on the subgenres and stuff, like a guy going into a record shop 20 years ago and finding out all like the subgenres of bands and stuff. So like, yeah, lit RPG lit or whatever, I had no idea what the hell
lit
that was.
RPG, yeah.
Lit RPG, yeah, I had no idea, never heard of it. so I'm learning all those kinds of terms and stuff on the whetstone. But yeah, my point, come back to what we're discussing here, that book, at least I myself, and of course this is subjective, and there's me coming in with what I like to read, what I'm looking to read today. It might not be the same as someone else's, almost certainly isn't. But I came into that book hoping for something a little more fast-moving, even though I knew it wasn't going to be your sword and sorcery, like little tight tale. It's a 400-page door wedge. And I'm at the end of the 4th chapter where something did start to happen again, but then it slid back into this ultra detail, and it just created a rhythm that felt kind of stop and start. It wasn't very satisfying to me, and I felt like the book was asking me to read too much to get too little reward. I'll read a big book. I'll read the biggest book. I read Stephen King's The Stand, unedited edition, still has coffee stains on the corner of the pages, every thought he's had for that whole story. I read that. So yeah, I feel comfortable saying like, I'll read your long thing if it rewards me for the extra time and energy to read your long detailed thing. And so to come back to the story here, one of the questions I think you might want to have in the back of your head when you're reviewing the details you put in is, well, is this worth the time I'm asking the reader to read it, right? Does this detail give them does it either do something utilitarian, right? Like it tells us something about the character, it tells us about the world, that we need to know? Does it reinforce theme? Does it do something? Or, because not everything has to do something, there's room for luxury, I feel, in storytelling. If it's like a pretty detail, if it's something that, then even then it can be kind of doing something in the sense that it helps immerse the reader deeper, right? And that's subjective, but I find with practice, you get a feel for it. I mean, how do you feel sometimes when you're like, okay, I want to put in a detail about, like, for example, if I'm going to move ahead here, there was a point, right, bottom of the 2nd page, you broke to a paragraph basically all about, the Street of Wonders was a bright, tangled thread of red, blue, and gold running north-south along the Isle of Lorden. And it goes further, but I won't read that because that's later. And you kind of basically just describe a bunch of the neighborhoods and how they connect in the city as we break between one scene and another one. So yeah, you have this paragraph describing bits and pieces of the city that the overall story is set in, and it's placed well, I think, because it's kind of between scenes, and so it gives a sensation of transit, the character that I like. But then the next sentence you go, 5 blocks up the Street of Wonders, Flew changed her mind and then kind of turns around to go back to where the previous scene took place. Yeah, again, not a bad decision, but it kind of made me go, oh, okay, and kind of jerk my head around a little bit in the sense that by reading the previous paragraph where you get to details like so close to the dangerous south shore of the Gaunt, it was mostly quick-stitch joints and blessings on the cheap, but even mercenaries needed to eat. Well, and now you've told me a bit about where the story is going. I have a better idea. Oh, mercenaries. Okay, that's going to come in later because of stealing the sword, right? But as someone reading this having no clue, I was like, oh, is Flu a mercenary? Like even she needs to eat? Is she in Gaunt now? And of course I got corrected by the next sentence, but it was this feeling of like, okay, well, then why did I read that previous thing except for to just kind of get like a city map in my mind that sort of got folded up immediately. And then the character is basically almost immediately going right back to where they were. Do you see what I mean?
I do, absolutely. And I'm glad that you picked out that particular paragraph because before sending you this draft, that paragraph got moved. And it was originally much closer to the beginning in the first scene where she's at this rat stall looking at the rats. And then I thought, well, gosh, I better try to set the scene a little bit. So, because they always talk about you don't want your characters just in a blank white room, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to show some sense of space and situation to what's going on. And so I thought, gosh, I better set the scene and maybe I could like slyly work in a little of backstory and world building and stuff here. And so I put it there a couple paragraphs in. And then as I was reading through it prior to sending it to you the other day, I hit that paragraph and realized like, wow, this just feels like I dropped it right in. Like it just did not flow at all. And so I thought, okay, where could this actually go? And I realized, well, after the section break, when she, because the idea is at that point, she's gotten this rat and she is walking back up the Street of Wonders. And so I thought, well, that would make sense as a place to put a description of the Street of Wonders. Yeah. But I do think that part of maybe what you're reacting to is that I literally just did like a cut and paste and dropped it in there. So this bit about mercenaries needing to eat, well, it's a reference to the fact that this rat seller, people are buying them to eat them, which Flu does not. So that's why that's there. But yeah, I mean, when you read it out like that, I could definitely see it doesn't seem to follow necessarily. It seems a little jarring, like, wait, mercenaries have to eat, but then we're just back on something else.
Yeah, okay. See how that happened. Yeah, that happens to me sometimes too when I'm editing, or even I'll get like a sentence fragment because I change my mind halfway through cutting a sentence, and then I come back and
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it needs to be integrated a little better. Yeah, and I was also trying to start to introduce this idea of the mercenaries. And again, I mean, originally this paragraph was much longer and it had a bunch of backstory about the city and what the situation is. And so on the Isle of Lorden, a bunch of mercenaries live there because on the south shore of the river connected by the Iron Bridge, there's all these monsters and they come over the bridge. And so basically the island in the middle is now just only mercenaries and adventurers live there because they're constantly under attack. And all that stuff was in there. But then that's the question of like, okay, cool, like fun world building or whatever, but we don't need to know that at this point in the story. Certainly, possibly not really even at all for the whole story, depending on how it shakes out.
Yeah.
So I cut that.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're seeing surgical scars here. Really.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Okay. So I say right now, I agree with your choice to remove that paragraph because if I just go from the end of the previous scene to 5 blocks up the Street of Wonders, Flu changed her mind. Yeah, you wouldn't need to do much to make that still work by removing that paragraph. So I think, yeah, that's a good choice. And I'm also glad that, at least in what I read here, it's not the opening to the story. I think as a first sentence goes, in the city of Lorden on the Street of Wonders, Flu Montagne attempted to buy a rat. Like, great.
Yeah, I like that one. I was happy when I came up with that.
Yeah, you got my attention because it's like, okay, we're in a city, all right. Oh, Street of Wonders, all right, cool. I don't know what any of this means, but they're fun names. I don't know anything yet. That wasn't a criticism, of course. And then, we got the character name. Great, no wasting time there. And what are they doing? Oh, they're trying to buy a rat. That's interesting. Why would you want to buy a rat? I'm going to keep reading. So, yeah, I think that's a good first sentence, and I'm glad it's not opening with the Street of Wonders as a bright tangle thread of red, blue, and gold, etc. Now, this is all subjective taste. At the end of the day, if you want to create more of a wondrous, like the city as the character, maybe you would open with that paragraph or something like it. But it's a short story, as we're both saying here, and sword and sorcery tends to be more rooted on the person than the place, I find.
Yeah.
So I think...
Yeah, although interestingly, I mean, we were talking about Tower of the Elephant earlier, that opens with the long description of the mall, and it's very cinematic, right? It's sort of, you see the neighborhood level first, and then it slowly zooms in, and you're kind of seeing incidental background characters, bribing guards with stained coin and all that stuff. And then you get to one tavern, and then in the tavern are a couple different people are introduced. And then, the slaver, the kidnapper, right?
All these wretched people. Gosh, what a hive of villainy or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Thank
right?
You. Yes. Correct.
Yeah, and then Conan kills them all 1 page later. But Yeah, and I really like that introduction. But at the same time, I'm not Robert E. Howard, and I'm not just going to ape what he did. And yeah, and to me, starting with a character who's doing something is always going to be a stronger start.
Yeah, I honestly, yeah, now you've said that, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I guess it could go either way. I mean, the big thing is, right, we would want it to kind of, the camera to go down, 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 and then finally like settle on essentially a close up of Flu, right?
Yes.
Whereas, of course, this paragraph, where it was when in the copy you sent me, I assumed I was following Flu around through these neighborhoods because we just come off of a scene ending with her, and then to find out that actually she'd only gone a little bit up the first location you mentioned, the Street of Wonders, and then turns around, made me wonder why I was told all the rest. So yeah, it sounds like cutting that out is a good idea, I think. And I would think put in any details in terms of streets and neighborhoods and why they are the way they are. Putting them in as we encounter them, I think, is better than having an upfront bit of narrative, whether it's right at the top of the story or somewhere a little further along. Like the whole thing with the mercenaries, I think a gradual introduction of them would work really well. Like I liked quite a bit the part where she comes back to try and cheat the rat jack. Pardon me, to try and trade back the rat that she's decided is not so great.
Yeah.
But she has cheated him, so oh dear, what if he realizes? And then the point where, the rat jack sees her, he obviously has figured out that she cheated him and is like, you there, yeah, guards, And I like this bit where you say, Flu snorted, the city watch never came to the Isle of Lord and why? 10 years ago, maybe, but now. And then, the writer's beloved M dash, a heavy hand, me too, man. A heavy hand clomped down on her shoulder. Got her, boss. Flu looked up. The big man's male coif and the scar-checkered face glowering within it described a life in private security. Okay, so yes, no, the guards don't come here, but the people with money have a way of working around that. And I thought, yeah, that's a fun way to learn that rather than just, she comes into the neighborhood and then we have description of like those facts, like you just laying them out. This is coming out of like a scene that's happening, and it's also fun because it has that little like she thinks she's good. Oh no, she isn't. Like that's always a nice little turnaround.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I really like that, and I thought that was a great way of weaving in world details because it's being woven into the action. Something I'm trying to get better about myself with describing my characters, for example, is avoiding something that Howard Andrew Jones called in his writing class that I took the portrait shot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, tell a little bit about what your character looks like because they're walking into scene maybe, but don't mention every little detail as they just stood still and posed for a portrait.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got like a short paragraph just laying it all out. To come back to Flu, I think you did all right with that. Flu considers the squirming rats, and so she's doing something and we're watching her do something. And the contrast, kind of like weaving in like the description of the rats and the description of Flu, like that all felt together of a piece. It didn't feel like a portrait description to me. But yeah, just that idea in general, right? Like if you ever feel like you're stopping to paint a portrait, ask yourself, is that what I really want to do? And if it is, like, well, okay, well, what does that do with the rhythm of things? And what does it do with the reader's perception of what's happening? Similar to how, again, to keep coming back to this thing that you've already fixed. But I think that it just helps illustrate, the Street of Wonders paragraph. That was kind of stopping to paint a portrait, right? That was stopping to pull out the map of the city, which can be lovely. But coming off the previous scene, as I say, gave a false impression that we were following Flu through all kinds of different places when it turned out she'd gone about, 5 blocks up and then turned around.
Yeah, so, and I think that paragraph, just off the top of my head, I mean, even if I just reordered it, because the idea is that she started near the southern tip of the island, the southern end of the street where this dangerous iron bridge is, and then she walks north a little bit before then changing her mind and coming back and getting herself into trouble. So possibly even just reordering it to match that physical motion may make it make a little more sense. I have to think about it, but it needs something.
I think you're right about reordering things to match the motion of your character. I would suggest instead of having like a straight little paragraph of all that stuff, putting it in as she moves around.
Yeah.
Maybe the Iron Bridge even, I don't know how grandiose you see it in your mind, but maybe the Iron Bridge kind of looms over the bit where she is with the Rat Jack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Street of Wonders float out of the Iron Bridge, looming over, casting a long shadow over the Rat Jack in his stall where Flu was checking out the rats. Let's say.
Yeah. And it's funny, we were talking earlier because you were asking, do I outline and that sort of thing? And I've grown enough as a person that to me, a first draft now almost feels just like a very, very detailed outline. And I think you're exactly right that paragraph is almost like notes. In a way that it's like, I've written myself a description that I should then take those notes and use them to set the scene as needed piece by piece. Like that paragraph needs to be broken up. The individual details may be worked into the narrative rather than left as a paragraph of notes.
Yeah, I think that would be a good exploration to do. Obviously at the end of the day, take or leave anything I say here, right? But that sounds like a good track to explore. And it's funny you should say that about like the first draft feeling like a detailed outline. Like, to come back to screenwriting, there's this thing called a treatment where they can be various lengths, of course. But I've known people who basically write the entire hour of television and they just write it like prose instead of screenplay format and leave out a good chunk of the dialogue. Only the really key lines will be put in. And then other scenes, it's like, Billy and Bobby argue for a minute and then finishing with Bobby going, "I'm your real dad."
Oh no, Bobby.
Yeah. Oh no. But you know what I mean? Like the real kicker, like scene ender lines or whatever, like the lines that really are, or they give a strong sense of character. Sure, we'll put in the odd bit of dialogue. But otherwise, you just kind of tell it almost like prose. And I have not had balls to try that with prose yet, but I've done that a bit with pilots, and I wonder if it might be an interesting exercise here. Is to, very much treat your first draft kind of like a screenplay treatment in the sense that you're just a super detailed outline and think about it that way. And then the next draft is you just going through and transforming it in a way from outline to prose. So I sort of subdivided in my notes here your concerns, but I don't know if we need to. We've talked about a bit of the first one here, right? Like regarding the city of Lorden. This is you in your email. It's got a setup that I think is fun and a little different, so I want to tell the reader about it, but it's not strictly relevant. Right. So I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff there. Unless there's something else you want to talk about with the city, I'm going to move on to your second sub-concern about your heroine. So is there anything else to do with the city you'd like to discuss before we move on?
No, I think we've really covered it, so I'm ready to move on.
Okay, great. So then, part 2B here. Again, I'm reading from your email. As far as Flu, our heroine, my concern is that holding back on her backstory creates distance between her and the reader, preventing them from getting attached. In this draft, I've tried to string in some clues about her background, and my thought is that in the scene that's beginning as the draft cuts off, I'll lay out the basics. That way, hopefully, the reader will feel more or less caught up as the adventure really begins. So I read this knowing nothing but these notes that I'm passing on to listeners, and I liked Flu. I felt invested. And I didn't feel any real distance. I mean, almost right away, I was like, okay, this person is down on the outs, and they're trying to buy a rat. I mean, nobody's doing that if they're having a good day. And they're trying to trick this person. Okay, cool. I want to see if they succeed.
Yeah.
Like that got me invested. Like the fact that what they're doing has really pulled me in more, I think, than if you'd stopped to lay out the basics.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, certainly, because it's the same thing, right? It's like I've got this maybe cool backstory for this character, and of course, I'm champing at the bit to try to let it all out. And I think there is to some extent a legitimate concern that if you've got a protagonist who's keeping a big secret from the audience, then you're going to have trouble getting the audience to identify with them. But again, trying to make her a compelling and interesting character that we want to follow while seeding in hints that there's more to her than initially meets the eye throughout, and hopefully getting to a point where by the time I do possibly do sort of the info dump, say okay, here's the character's backstory, that the reader is curious enough to actually want to learn it, right? So, I mean, again, it's not something you can just put up front because people are going to say, I don't care, right? This is let me tell you about my Dungeons & Dragons character, It's never as interesting to anybody else.
I really did a great explanation of why they have Charisma 12. It's great. Captivating.
It's fascinating. Yeah, there's a writing guru who I really love named Matt Bird. And if you have never heard of him, Oliver, highly recommended. His book is called Secrets of Story, and he's got another one coming out next year some point. But he is a screenwriter mainly, and so that's kind of where he's coming from. So I think you might jibe with a lot of his ideas. But man, I mean, he has just done so much work around what makes a character compelling, what makes a character someone that an audience will get attached to and invested in, and that sort of thing. And it really opened my mind to how to actually start trying to think about some of this stuff. And one of the things that he says is you should never give a character's backstory in the scene where they're introduced. And so what he says is, you can either give a little bit of backstory before the character is actually introduced, in which case then when we meet the character, there can be something surprising about them that we didn't expect from their backstory. Or we meet the character and then later we learn their backstory, which we're surprised by because it wasn't what we expected from the character that we just met. And he says it much more cogently than this and gives good examples and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. You're paraphrasing. Yeah.
Yeah. But, the idea is what I'm going for here is to say, okay, we've got, she's a street urchin, her hair is matted, her clothes are dingy, she's starving, she's trying to scam some money and get a rat. And okay, we feel like we've seen this character before. So the idea that I'm going for at least is to say, okay, we've seen, street thief, urchin, fantasy character a million times, but hopefully there's a sense that, okay, there's something a little different about Flu and the audience will be interested to learn what that is when it actually comes up.
Okay. Would it be helpful if I shared with you what my feelings were as I read it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, as I say, the first sentence just grabbed me right away because I was like, why are you buying a rat? So, again, actions, right? I think that grabbed me far more than, as you say, if there'd been like an info dump at the top. And honestly, like they happen in even like my absolute favorite sword and sorcery short stories. So like the info dump is not the devil, but I think it's one of those things where like aim for the moon and shoot for the moon, and even if you fail, you'll land amongst the stars.
Yeah.
Motivational
Written by
poster.
somebody who does not know astronomy at all.
Yeah. Hey, you take that back. That motivational poster I remember from my grade 10 English class means a lot to me. But weirdly, it has stuck in my damn head. And I think in a sense, it's kind of the thing here where it's like to completely and utterly never explain anything would be kind of bananas unto itself. Although if you pull it off and you still make a great story, amazing, gold star. I think with this is, I would say fight the urge to have an info dump anywhere.
Okay.
And give as little as you can, as late as you can. And in terms of this idea of a character having a secret, and then therefore that creates a distance that we don't, it makes it hard for us to relate to them. To me, it's like that secret can be almost like the filling of of a candy, where we're not at the like chocolate or gum or whatever at the center. And so that's not what we're going to connect with because it's hidden. But we can still very much enjoy the candy coating, right? Mm-hmm. The candy coating can be what draws them in. And by which I mean, to follow this metaphor, which is hopefully won't get too tortured, is the candy coating here is she's buying a rat, God damn it. And she's buying a rat. She's picky about which rat she gets, making me wonder what's the hierarchy here. She pulls out, and by the way, I thought this was a good way of doing what you're trying to do here, get some world information in, again, through actions, not through dialogue dumps or whatever. I like the fact that the currency seems to be chess pieces.
Yeah.
Right? This whole thing where she pulled, and you don't say like, the currency became chess pieces 10 years ago when the chess guys took over town. It was weird. And anyway, moving on. No, you just have her other hand pulled a small gleaming rook from within her jacket. And I really found that intriguing, especially, and then the fact that you actually have the cardinal distinctions in the next sentence is kind of fun when I think about bishops and chess. A, I just thought it was a cool world detail, but again, B, like it's this thing of her like pulling like a coin that seems to be beyond her, right? Mm-hmm. That's intriguing. Then I was like, oh, did she steal it? Which we find out later she did. But for a little bit, I was kind of like, oh, is she like a fallen noble? And this is her last big coin that she has, and she's got to use it carefully. Like I was trying to figure her out, and I was enjoying trying to figure her out as I was reading through this, and that engaged me. As far as, whether I want to, I like Flu or whether I want to have a beer with Flu, well, I'm kind of rooting for her by default to begin with because she's the protagonist, and that's what we do, right? And we've all heard, I think, especially if you spend too much time online, the idea of protagonist brain, where people in life start to feel like they're the center of the universe because we all watched so many stories where the protagonist is the center, and then what they're doing must be good because they're the main protagonist. Coming back to memories of Breaking Bad and how so many people got mad at Walter White's wife for, harshing his adventures, and it's like she's discovering she's married to a man who's putting her in constant jeopardy and her son in constant jeopardy, but she's getting in the way of the protagonist. Like that just illustrates the strength of what I'm talking about, where Blue being the protagonist right away, I'm kind of like, all right, what's the deal here? You hooked me with the rat buying thing, and then I'm following a little further, like everything she does, as long as it's interesting, and it is, I find in this draft you sent me, that engages me. So if she has a big deep dark secret that we maybe don't even learn this story, maybe it's just hinted at, and in the sequel we're going to get it, I think that's fine. Unless that secret or secrets are desperately needed to satisfy a payoff or achieve some other goal, right, that you've got. Like if the secret is the thing, sure, but I still don't know the name of Conan's mom and dad.
Yeah.
I still don't know exactly why he left. In Howard Stories, if I remember correctly, he just kind of occasionally says like, well, he came south because he wanted to plunder and get the rewards of civilization that were not up north.
Yeah.
But we never get like a detailed breakdown of that. And here we are still talking about him how many decades later. I think less is more always with this stuff, and revealing each detail as late as you can, preferably through action. Like I say, having that rook be part of this whole fiddle faddle that she's pulling, as opposed to just a brief discussion of coinage and why it's chess. So does that help?
Yeah, and I find that very useful because, this was an unanswered question for me. The question is always, I know what I'm going for, but is it working? And mm-hmm. It's satisfying and gratifying to have you basically say back to me that what I was trying to do came across, because that's exactly the goal, right? Mm-hmm. Is to say, okay, we don't need a bunch of backstory right up front, but if she's a person who's doing something interesting, who seems to have interesting opinions on the world or an interesting view of the world, hopefully that'll be enough. And I had thought maybe, like I said, in this next scene that I'm about to write, that mm-hmm. maybe, okay, I can give enough of the backstory that then we're kind of caught up with her, quote unquote. But yeah, maybe not. I mean, It's certainly, I was looking at it as I can see a way to use this scene to deliver that information, but I don't think I have to for the story. So maybe I'll try it first, not doing that, and see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, you can always make, like, do you write in Word or Scrivener, or what do you like to use?
I use Scrivener, yeah.
There you go. So Scrivener, I mean, yeah, it's very easy to just like put a note in, you know, of like write the short sentence, but then put up the paragraph of like all the details I'm thinking about jamming in, you know, yeah, just put that on the side and know that you can always go back and insert it later. I do find that by and large, you can take anything too far. And I have been given notes on my own work where they're like, I can see you were trying not to drown us in detail, but I don't know what's happening in this part.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, that's the other fear, right? Is that people are just left adrift and have no idea what's going on.
Absolutely. But at least in my experience as a reader and as a writer, that happens way less than people just being drowned in detail. And even if they're like okay with it, they're like, oh, it's all right. You know, they might still enjoy it more if there were even fewer details. And so I won't say never, but by and large, I have tended to be fine with it if I've cut details and then I come to the draft later and maybe I don't even remember they were there. That's how little they were needed. So yeah, I mean, this is a first draft, so you're still figuring it out, of course. But I definitely think as an exercise in any given scene, see how you can convey information about character and location through actions and only giving things as they are made relevant by those actions.
Yep.
And then see how it feels. That would be my sort of big note to your main concerns here.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, by all means, question me or question what I'm saying, because maybe I need to go deeper myself. Maybe I need to add a little more detail. Oh, irony. But I think this has gone pretty well. I have another little tiny notes, bits and pieces here and there that I'm going to send you a PDF with like little Post-its on it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
For those, so you can go through those at your own leisure and not feel like you got to wait for me to put this episode out, which I'm not sure. It honestly might be as late as February. So, you know, for your purposes, certainly I will send you that email with those little notes and stuff. And yeah, I'll just say that I find the story very fun and very intriguing. I'm into Flu. I want to know what's going on with her. I want to see where this is going. And yeah, but one more note I'll put in here, because this is also something to keep in mind, the world building and the character intrigue and all that. Because this is third person over Vaux's, my novel. Wow, good work, Oliver. This is third person over the shoulder of Flu's life. You know, you can get that through the description. Like, I like the part where she's looking at her rat after she's changed her mind and being like, well, you know, it's silvery sheen reminded one of a rapier's blade, or at least it had when she was buying it. Now it looked more like the belly of some dead-eyed river fish. Well, the rat size was noble, regal even, or perhaps just corpulent. Like, the going back and forth there, that told me more of value about her than if you had just been like, you know, she's sometimes indecisive about rats. Ever since she was a kid, she had to choose the perfect rat or her dad would hit her. Like, yeah, I mean, I guess it comes back to the oldest advice in the book, right? You're showing me, not telling me.
Yeah.
So there you go, right? Well, okay. Well, now I've ended on the absolute pinnacle of hokey writing advice. I think, you know, we're at 55 minutes here. Feels good to me. Unless there's anything furthermore you'd like to briefly discuss?
Gosh, no, I don't think so. I mean, you've certainly addressed the two main concerns that I had in ways that I frankly found very useful. So I feel like I'm going forward knowing what I need to tweak in this draft and having a better idea of what I need to write next. So honestly, Oliver, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate the time and your effort and to helping me.
Oh, cheers. It's like I said, it's just something I really enjoy doing. And then thank you for sharing your story and being comfortable sharing it publicly, because that ain't easy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it.
Got to learn to let go, man.
I seem to have beaten all the shame out of myself somehow. Well, not beaten. Yeah, careful with your metaphors or whatever there, buddy. But yeah, I seem to have wrung out all my shame a long time ago, thank goodness. That seems to come in handy for doing this kind of thing, but you can't expect that of everybody. So yeah, again, I really appreciate that. All right, well, it was lovely talking to you, and I guess I'll see you on the Discord, man. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
So I'm Writing a Novel features original music by Gloria Guns and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Bonus points if you record yourself and send me an MP3 I can cut into the show. Doesn't have to be fancy, using your phone is fine, just keep it clear and concise. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing, that's @sowriting. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, and checking out patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Patrons get to be thanked in the final novel, listen to episodes of the podcast a week early, and even enjoy a whole bonus podcast called So I Wrote a Novel, where I read and comment on chapters of previous works, starting with my first novel, Junkyard Leopard. Thanks for hanging out with me, and Nathaniel, and I'll see you soon.